Thank you very much, Program Director Siseko Kumalo, and welcome to everybody who has joined us. Thank you very much for gracing us in this very important occasion for the establishment of the policy space. I just want to start off generally by making general remarks before I actually go into the substance of our presentation. Really, I think the idea here of launching this institution today is that we want to bring together a number of young and emerging researchers and public policy thinkers who we consider to be, carrying great potential and having a lot to offer both the institution but also the country, the public at large. And as you know, intellectual workers are often referred to as cultural workers who really combine passion, work, income, impact. In other words, as intellectual workers, we more or less resemble artists or athletes who basically have fun whilst they actually do their work. So I'm hoping that the policy space can be a space where people can have fun whilst they actually make a living, but also at the same time make an impact out there. So that's the spirit that really, sort of partly informs the establishment of this institute. Today, basically, the launch will be more of a corporate launch, which will focus more on strategy and the specific focus areas that we're going to be working on. So it will be a high-level principle presentation, which really takes you through, the character of the organization, what we seek to do, and what we hope to achieve. But I must also caution everybody that we actually are an institution that enjoys intellectual freedom. So some of the things that I may say here may not be acceptable to some of my associates, and that's the nature of the work that we do. That's the nature of the institution. We don't have to always agree. So some of the nuances will be points that are points of emphasis relevant to me and how I see things. But in general, there is agreement on the philosophy of the organization and how we intend to enter and play our role in the space. I also need to thank, sincerely, all our associates who have graciously agreed to actually join into this uncertain venture. Quite a very daunting task, but I think that they all believe in the idea of us having to imagine, create, and evolve our public policy space as well as our country. Just to go straight to it, if I may have the first slide. Second one. The second one, yes. So I think the starting point really is to lay out the 10-year horizon from now, to basically demonstrate and show the picture about how we intend to go about, developing this organization from phase 1 right up to phase 3. And as you can see here, the idea is to really demonstrate that we're gonna be pacing ourselves properly, because we do know that there is no idea that has ever been perfect at inception. So our different phases in the next 10 years are actually focusing on making sure that we lay a very strong foundation for an institution of this nature. So the first 3 years, really, the major focus will be on establishing and making sure that we actually have a strong and a firm foundation. And hopefully in the next 3 to the 6 year period, we're going to see, an organization that is stabilizing, an organization that is consolidating. And by the time we reach the 10th year, hopefully we should be seeing ourselves basically doing much more than we actually had projected. The next slide, please. And then really, I think the starting point really is to really talk about two important things. And this is basically not in the slide, but these are two important elements about the space in which we are going into, just to basically briefly define the kind of space and context of knowledge, as well as public policy, um, think tank space. The starting point really for us is that if you look around in South Africa today, there isn't a lot of think tanks that are led by Black intellectuals. And that is a big concern because we obviously live in a country that, is located in the African continent, and that has got a lot of implications for the type of institutions that we should have in terms of identity, in terms of ideas, in terms of the vision, and all of that. And for us, it is an important element to underscore that we actually do need more institutions of this kind led by ourselves. And we shouldn't be ashamed to basically say that. And when we have the opportunity to establish institutions of this nature, we should do so and be very proud and committed to pursue such ideas. Now, if you look at it, for those of you who follow the rankings of think tanks globally, the Pennsylvania University in the US normally issues the annual rankings. You will see that generally in South Africa, you have Accord, which is ranked #1 in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's also a Black-led think tank. You have Mistra sitting at number 51, if I'm not mistaken, where sub-Saharan Africa is concerned. And of course, you've got a few others that are in between here, either independent or located in the university space. But I think that it's important that we understand that we do need more and more, of these think tanks to be established. And coming to the question of research and development, I think we all now know that all states establish their legitimacy on the basis of economic development. And states that do not pursue or succeed in achieving better outcomes insofar as development is concerned, they actually suffer, in terms of legitimacy. And research and development really is about making sure that we've got industry is developed, making sure that we've got patents that we can actually commercialize and use those to industrialize. research and development is important for human development. It's important for a growth of the economy. It's important for creation of value. It's important for creation of wealth, and it's important for redistribution. So research and development is quite an important thing. And when you look at the standing of South Africa within the BRICS countries and some of our peer, countries like, Malaysia, Turkey, and and others in our category, you can see that South Africa is basically not performing well in this regard, and it's quite a great concern for us as a new think tank. But we also think that it's an area where South Africa should actually be focusing on to assist our country to actually move forward. So our performance there really needs to improve, tremendously. We haven't as yet reached the 1 percentage mark of the GDP invested in R&D, and that is a major cause of concern if you look at it in terms of our peers and how we actually perform.
The next slide also speaks about the fact that you have the similar kind of picture that, can I please have the next slide? You have this almost a similar picture in terms of projection, in terms of how it is forecasted, how many scientists and engineers you have per million people. It actually tells you that kind of a picture, and it really tells you where South Africa is actually located. If you look at the gray areas, that's where Middle East and Africa is located. And if you look at a country like Brazil, which actually compares well with us, is actually slightly ahead. And that creates a bit of a problem for us from a development and a competition point of view in terms of our peers. It really gives you the picture of where we're going and where our priorities are actually lying in the process. Next slide, please. Then I just want to actually go through what I would call, global and national trends in terms of understanding the moment in which our think tank is actually coming in. That this type of a general understanding and identification of the global trends is quite important for us as a new organization that enters the think tank space as a knowledge institution, that we should be able to appreciate where we are as a country, but also where we are as the world. The first thing really is that we would agree that the forward march of history actually shows to us that there's been much progress in terms of humankind making progress on a number of areas, such as production for our own sustainability and livelihoods, in terms of technology, in terms of movement of people, in terms of medical science, and of course, massive changes that we've had in terms of geopolitics. We have had, of course, the settlement, the global settlement after the Second World War. We've had the Cold War, and then we've also had, of course, the global economic crisis as one of the remarkable kind of events and processes at the global scale, which has not left Africa and South Africa actually unscathed in terms of our position and our positioning. And then also we have had a lot of global pandemics, HIV/AIDS being one of them, and many others, including now at the moment, COVID-19. Medical science communities that, you are likely to have more of these pandemics coming for a variety of reasons, including some of the hypotheses, actually including the question or the problem of climate change. and then of course in the continent we've had major successes and victories insofar as the defeat of official apartheid and colonialism. And then of course we've had since especially since 1994 we've had both mixed fortunes in terms of a depressed economy and a resilient economy residing side by side from time to time, depending on the period and the performance of the various indicators in the country. And that is quite an important thing to notice, because I think that our successes and our progress as a country is quite a mixed bag, and we should appreciate where we do make a lot of strides and where we actually lag behind. And then of course, there's a lot of demographic shifts that are taking place globally, locally and regionally. And then we've also had cultural struggles, a bit of progress and lack thereof in that space. We have had at a global scale resurgence of right-wing movements in Europe, in North America. We have had a resurgence of racism in the developed North, but also persistent racism in countries like South Africa and elsewhere. And then, of course, we have to be that we have the long forward march of history that I'm talking about has also seen us make some, qualitative progress in terms of the quality of life of our people. But then also there has been, setbacks, especially in recent history, in terms of the legitimacy of our policies, programs, as well as the state. But what then is our starting point? What then is our starting point? Our view really, and this is actually at the core of the kind of work and the kind of attitude that we actually possess as a new organization, is that how would you define public policy? And I know that the public perception out there is that public policy is really what government and states do. And that's actually quite a very limited, quite a very limited perspective and a quite limited understanding of what public policy is about. In our case, and would want to argue that our definition as a working definition is quite a useful one, because it actually begins to actually make sure that send the dichotomies or the binaries, the binary positions or the binary definitions that you'd find, that seeks to actually posit that the private sector exists on its own for its own purposes and in its own space. And on the other hand, the public sector exists for its own purposes in its own space and for whatever ends that it has. And our view really is that public policy really is for the best possible ways to achieve outcomes. This is quite useful because, as I will be talking later on the role of the private sector and the state on the question of development, it will quite become even more clearer. The next slide, please. So, as a country, where are we and where do we come from in terms of our performance in relation to public policy since 1994 in particular? What kind of foundation has been laid? You can look at the various things, you can sort of isolate them and list them one by one. But in the end, in my view, these are the four things that we have sought to do since the beginning of 1994. The first one really is the establishment of political democracy. The fact that there's no government that can claim authority over this land and over the people of this country without being duly and democratically voted for and chosen by the majority. Which is quite important about our forward march since 1994, is about really institutional reforms. And in this regard, we're talking about rules, the rule of law, human rights, legislation, policies, and laws such as the competition law, the public service, the reform there, separation of powers as a doctrine, and the establishment of new organs in the democratic space. And then you can go on insofar as institutional reforms is concerned. And in this sense, as you will see in terms of our output and our work, our understanding of institutions is not only institutions of bricks and mortar. When we talk of institutions, we're talking about the rules that are actually used to actually mediate the various interests in our society. So if you talk of the rule of law itself is an institution, right? So you don't look at the Human Rights Commission and simply say that's an institution, but the definition and the concept of institutions goes beyond a bricks and mortar, goes beyond individuals and people or a group of people. Then the third thing really is, of course, about new class formation, and here is the socio-economic sphere of our progress as a country. Both the negatives and the positives, the progress and the regress, the contradictions that emerge. That's why we actually prefer to call it a source of optimism as well as conflict. Because on the one hand, we've made massive progress in terms of bringing a considerable number of Black people in the country into the mainstream economy and other forms of economic participation. But at the same time, a lot of people have actually been left in the margins of society. And those are the majority of people that we are all concerned about as think tanks, as government, as the private sector, etc. So for us, this is quite very important. And then the last element really is the inclusion of South Africa into the international community, as you know. So our insertion in the continent, our insertion in the a global community of nations was quite a progress, and we should really. But the issue that arises really is whether the South African dream, the South African dream, what really constitutes it? What about the promise that we have had in 1994 of unity and prosperity? And our argument really is that without unity and prosperity, all the areas of progress that we have made will actually come to naught if we actually don't attend to the question of unity and prosperity. And prosperity really takes different forms in terms of the happiness of people, of the nation in different forms. You can talk in the economic sphere of defeating poverty. You can talk of inequality. You can talk about defeating income inequality and all of that. And so, but for us, I think, and I'm going to speak to this at length when we talk about the question of development, is that what is it that as South Africans we have done, have not done, and can do better to make sure that we actually have a better development trajectory in every sphere. I want to really get to this slide. Actually talks about who we are, because I really want to introduce who we are as an organization, to indicate that most importantly, we have to underscore the fact that we consider ourselves as a progressive and a Pan-African institution, and progressive in the broader sense, informed by our philosophy, which actually seeks to keep a healthy balance between ideas, people, nature, and resources. Because at the end of the day, one of the existential questions is whether our human civilization can actually sustain our activities as a human race insofar as the livelihoods that we lead. Can we really afford to have progress that is actually working against our natural environment? Can we really afford to have progress that really works against our people? Can we really afford to have resources that are really not channeled, to ensure that as we pursue the ideal or the vision of change, we also have a bit of harmony with all the elements that are crucial for our own existential purposes. And then, of course, as people would know, that's our vision and our mission. But also, I think what is quite crucial here is to underscore that we are going to be an organization that is independent, but the independence is actually defined in a very context-specific independence. So, philosophically, as we all know, no matter how you can profess that you can be independent or neutral, there is no such a thing as philosophical neutrality. You can never achieve it, not in this lifetime, I hope not in the next lifetime, if ever there's a next lifetime. But you can never have philosophical neutrality. But the question is, do you have sufficient autonomy from sectoral and sectional interests in society? That becomes the central question whenever you establish an organization, or whenever you set up a vision, or whenever you set up a particular project that is in the interest of national development. Our definition really is quite very simple and very clear, that we are going to have embedded autonomy. In other words, we will operate within and above the state, we'll operate within the sectors, we'll operate within the various interests in society, and we will actually contest the space, just like all other interests and other voices are contesting the space. So we're not going to claim to be independent from any ideological passions and persuasions. And I will speak to the issue of our biases in the next slides. So what do we basically do? Just like all other think tanks, we basically provide those types of services. We've got those services that we will be providing on a commercial basis. So the next time I've got a few of my colleagues who have logged on here. The next time you want me to come and speak at your organization, you'll have to pay for my time, because as they say, time is money. Those are the products and services that we provide, and those are the areas which we specialize on. And as I've said at the beginning, our organization is evolving. We are creating it, we're imagining it all the time. And it's an organization that will actually evolve in all these areas. So those areas of specialization may change over time. And it's quite crucial that you take note of that as a participant today. So our work is basically separated between two elements, which is the commercial element, as well as the public interest work, which is actually unlimited. But in the meantime, for the next year, for the next 3 years, which we've correctly defined as the establishment phase, we're going to be focusing on some of the special projects, which we hope some of you here can actually fund. We hope we can, after this presentation, secure some funding for some of these works. So one of the crucial things that we believe in is that we are going to undertake a project that we call the Next South Africa project. This project really will be looking at the various things, activities, conversations, and ideas that we can put together as South Africans who have a stake in this country and in the continent to basically undertake those particular activities and issues to actually define and redefine the next South Africa that we hope to live in, prosper in, unite in, and actually develop in. So the Next South Africa project is exactly about that. How can we actually recast the South African dream and make sure that we actually have a better South Africa, and make sure that we've got a massive interaction in this space. The other area really is the area that we refer to as the lobby reality. One of the things that we really want to propose, and it's quite a controversial thing, and I'm sure you would have seen that we have, in the lobby industry, we have both a black market in the lobby industry as well as an above board kind of lobby industry. And as you know, business and other sectors of society, such as labor and the church and everybody else, depending on their interest and positioning and what they want to achieve in terms of their goals, wherever they are, they would from time to time contest and lobby the state and other interested parties on how they can actually shape public policy. And our view is that, you know, because most of this type of work, which is quite great work, by the way, which is welcome, it happens in every society, because most of this work is actually unaccounted for. Some of it is actually not reported on, but you do have, you know, influencers, movers and shakers in our economy, in our society, and in the state. They are unaccounted for, unlike our voters in the country who can account every 5 years where their vote goes to. But these guys actually influence and direct the trajectory of our country, our future, the balance of forces in every sense you can think of. They actually make a telling contribution, but they are not accounted for properly. And our view is that perhaps it is time to basically, you know, work on a project to regularize and actually professionalize and actually formalize the sector and make sure that it actually pays its dues. And then, of course, I think the third one is the Lekgotla, which basically is about dialogues and putting together fresh content as well as new formats of dialogue. As I draw to a close, because I only have 15 slides, then someone would ask, and I think this is a very important slide, and I'm going to ask a bit of time from the program director to spend a bit of a minute or two on this one. The biggest question that always arises, of course, is the question that is in the lips and the minds of everybody. So what unique contribution are we going to make in the space? We actually believe that in the next 10 years, we can actually work on the following questions. How do we actually strengthen, you know, good institutional arrangements as well as introduce new institutional arrangements in the space? For those of you who may not be familiar with the concept of institutional arrangements in economic terms refers to the various institutions, processes, systems, such as your regulation, infrastructure, the law, funding, you know, social compacting and all of that. The role players basically bringing together role players, bringing together different interests and different interests that of course will converge on a particular issue. It can be any issue. It can be health, it can be education, it can be tourism, it can be anything. You know, it can be aviation. But what we are observing in South Africa today is that among other things that we actually suffer from is that some of the institutional arrangements we've had since 1994 have either become weak, they have failed, they are not working as they should. And in this regard, I want to make a few examples of this type of problem or challenge. Is that the first challenge that you have actually is that you can have successful institutional arrangements which have proven to be quite good in the context of South Africa. And one of them is, as an example, the tourism sector in terms of nature conservation, for instance. So in the country, the question often arises. So if you have a community that is in a space where the country or UNESCO or everybody regards this place as a treasure for national and international conservation of nature. But you do have to have the various role players, such as, you know, the community, the business community. You have to have government, you have to have local government, provincial government coming together to actually establish what is the best way to actually conserve that, that space. There's a lot of contestation there because there's a lot of interest, because in the first instance, that community would want to live off that natural resource, but you've got to bring them together. And we've got a lot of those. If you go to Mpumalanga, if you go to the Eastern Cape, we've got a lot of those quite successful institutional arrangements. They work, they make business sense. There's a lot of progress and the institutional arrangements are very robust. Then the other example would really be a kind of a West example of an institutional arrangement. And I'm going to upset a few people here, of course. We're looking at the industry we call football in the country. So football is both good for our national happiness index, but also football is a cultural aspect, is a cultural movement. But football is also a football economy. There's a whole economy on football. And that's why we've got the World Cup and all of that. But you know, football, and I'm gonna make 3 quick examples which will upset people. You look at the state of Bafana Bafana, you look at the state of Pirates and Kaizer Chiefs. Very serious problems if you look at the performance at the local, at the regional, and at the global stage. What you have basically in the country is that, and we must make this bold for everybody to know, that South Africa compares very well at a global scale in terms of football ability and performance to Brazil, one of the best footballing nations in the world. But the problem with our football situation in the country is that our institutional arrangements in that sector depresses us a lot, weekend to weekend, month to month, year to year, World Cup to World Cup, on the basis that you have got government that cannot say anything to SAFA, and you've got SAFA that cannot say anything to the PSL. And the vicious cycle goes on and on. So the kind of institutional arrangements you have in that space actually expose you, and they actually tell you the worst form of institutional arrangements. And this actually plays itself in various other sectors of our society. You can look at the church and many other spaces. Then the other one, which is actually quite a very interesting space, is the one that is actually forthcoming. The health sector, the national health insurance, and the reform that we have to have in the public health system. So for instance, I can tell you now, and I'm happy to be proven wrong, that one of the reasons why the national health insurance may not succeed in South Africa and may actually be frustrated is not because we don't have capacity. We've got a lot of medical academic hospitals and medical faculties in this country. We produce the best in terms of medical science and medical doctors. We've got capacity technically and medically speaking in terms of medical science. We've got capacity insofar as managing the administration of health in the country. We've got capacity in terms of marshalling the resources and all of that. And then, as you know now that we've got the NHI bill, that we've got political will and political capacity. But the issue that will actually frustrate the national health insurance, which is actually the biggest public policy reform in the country, is the fact that our institutional arrangements are quite weak and are not going to be helping us to actually move in this area. So I'm not going to be talking to the other areas. We can talk about them in the question and answer session, but I think that you get the picture of where we're going. And our view in the next slide that you see in front of you is that contrary to many beliefs in our country, to the predominant view that you have in the media at the moment, the biggest challenge in our country at the moment is actually not corruption. Corruption, yes, is very important. You've got to attend to it. You must actually resolve it. You must, if you think that I'm underplaying corruption, you must just look at how China actually deals with corruption, right? So in China, if you have stolen money of the people in the public space, and you reach a particular threshold in terms of the millions, you actually get sentenced to death. So that's how serious corruption is. But we want to argue that actually, those are actually manifestations of a bigger problem. The problem that you have in this country is that development has been derailed in different ways. Whether you look at infrastructure, human development, you look at health and education, you look at investment in terms of, development in terms of industrialization and all of that. We are quite behind that. Whether you look at finance institutions or the the commercial banks, the state, and so on. The question is, where are we in terms of development? And when you look at the Human Development Index, globally from the United Nations, when you look at the Human Development Index here in the country, we are not actually doing well. And for me, that is the biggest challenge that we face. And secondarily, of course, the question of ideas and how we appreciate them, the stamina we have for ideas, the appetite we have for ideas, the appetite we have for statistics and numbers and data, the question of leadership, as well as the issue of building institutions, which is why we're building this institution today. So in terms of, I'm gonna summarize that very quickly because I've run out of time completely. We are actually entering the space operating in the economy, and I think we appreciate what that means. We've got to modernize all our systems, our traditions, our practices, how we actually do the process of knowledge production, dissemination, and consumption. And that actually speaks to that. So that is why you'll find that we've got a YouTube channel, we're on Facebook, in the social media, and we're everywhere, so that people can consume our products wherever they are, no matter what time of the day, whether they're in the country or elsewhere. As they travel, people should even have the possibility to listen to some of our insights and the contributions that we make. The next slide speaks basically to our delivery model. It's very important that we speak to that because it will speak to the fact that we're collaborating. We've got a network of associates which are already on the website. Those of you who will have time to check our website, that's what we have. But I think most importantly for us is the digital platforms that we are going to be introducing to modernize the space. A lot of other institutions like your Brookings institutions, your Council for Foreign Relations, your South African Institute for International Affairs, they have already gone a huge mile in that space of making the services and the products more digital and accessible to as many people as possible. In terms of governance, of course, I think you know that we are now a registered institution. We have a leadership in place. We are going to be soon appointing an advisory board. We are going to have an annual conference of the associates. And then we have appointed a panel of 4 selectors in different areas of academic and intellectual work who are going to assist us with the recruitment process. And then lastly, basically, is to speak about talent management and how we actually intend to deal with recruitment and retention. And here, as I said earlier on, we've got the inaugural cohort, which is introduced in our website. And then, of course, the spaces are limited. We cannot take everybody, but we renew the talent that we have on an annual basis. We also have particular benefits that accrue to our associates, and they will accrue over a period of time. And this is quite, we are quite very happy to be working with some of these guys. The last slide, I think this is probably the last one. Basically, that's what we're looking at in terms of organizational development. We're going to be perfecting the delivery model over a period of time. It's not going to be 100% from the beginning. We are going to give privilege and value more the South African experience. So for instance, when you, talk about problems about state capacity and implementation of programs, we have to look around our own South African experience, for instance, about how do you turn around state-owned enterprises. We don't have to go to the rest of the continent or in Asia or in America. There are a lot of turnaround examples that we can look at, which we can learn from within the country. And I think we've got best practice within the country and we must take advantage of that. And I think it's very important that we actually pace ourselves properly and ensure that we've got sustainability going forward. This actually brings me to the end. I'm sorry I took a bit long, Program Director, but I think the area that I really wanted to emphasize on is the area of institutional arrangements, which is actually quite a very big challenge for a country like South Africa. Thank you very much and welcome to the policy space.
There are incredible difficulties with attempting to tell your boss to sort of stop at this particular point in time because the time has expired. Nonetheless, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Executive Director, for that. You mentioned a couple of issues here that I think are very, very useful and maybe interesting to consider. You talk about the sort of idea of the sort of underpinning philosophy and the lack of intellectual bias with the kind of work that we do. And you reminded me there of Bertrand Russell in that seminal collection he did, The Problems of Philosophy of 1912. And he gives us at the end a concluding essay where he talks to, I suppose, the value of philosophy. And he says that it opens the thinker up to the thought that is being pursued, subsequently facilitating modalities of character development for said thinker who pursues said thought. In that particular spirit of our ability to open ourselves up to pursue new ideas, to critique the institutional arrangements that we have, and I suppose in that particular way to then arrange these sort of social institutions as well as arrangements in ways that are responsive to the socio-political needs of our people. I would like to invite our organizers and the technical team to sort of give us a very brief kind of walkthrough around the website which folk can access, which really gives us a very sort of detailed understanding of what it is that the policy space is about and what it is that we do. Namulelo, might I hand over to you and your folks? As we cue that, I was reminded of another particular seminal scholar and thinker, Ali A. Mazrui, when he talks to the notion of intellectual freedom. And he says, of course, the real measure of intellectual freedom, as we were sort of considering the institutional structure of the policy space, the real measure of it is, of course, the kind of decision-making capacity that participating individuals have within the institution in terms of intellectual freedom as well as intellectual democracy. And I trust, of course, and I'm very certain that the space will be one that facilitates that in very useful ways. Thank you very much, and let's take it away with the demonstration. Thank you, colleagues.
The Polisee Space is a progressive Pan-African public policy consulting firm. It delivers its services through a network of associates who are enthusiastic about public policy innovation. True to its innovative method of delivery, the Polisee Space will maximize on the use of digital platforms like its official website to interact and inform the public on some of its cutting-edge work. The Polisee Space website has 5 important features. The first is an extensive biography of all its associates, which can be found under the Associates tab in the website. This is so that you are aware that your work is in capable hands of South Africa's most forward and thought leaders. The second is a list of services that the Polisee Space will offer. You can find this listed under Services. At the bottom of the page, you will find a shortcut button to a form you can fill in should you wish to procure any of the services on offer. The organization will make direct contact with you upon filling in the form. The third important feature is the ability to fund a special project. The special projects are listed both under the landing page and under the tab Special Projects. These special projects are self-initiated by the organization and will require your generous donations to be completed. The shortcut button available both on the landing page and the tab Special Projects will direct you to a short form to fill in should you wish to make a donation. The fourth important feature is both the Multimedia Resource Tab and the Media tab, which will feature important documents, podcasts, videos, articles, and other important work by the organization. Finally, the organization would love to interact with you. The phone number, email address, and social media pages can be found under the Contact Us tab or right at the bottom of the landing page. We look forward to interacting with you.
And on that particular note, colleagues, we then, of course, swiftly move along to the next speaker on our program. And it is such a delight, really, to be able to share such a space with such auspicious individuals who are making very useful contributions to society. I'd like to introduce Mr. Busani Ngqaweni, who is principal of the National School of Government, where he joined after serving as head of policy in the presidency. He is also an adjunct professor at the University of the Witwatersrand School of Government, and of course, the Sokou University in China. He writes for various papers, including the Daily Maverick, and of course, the Eyewitness News. Mr. Ngqaweni, over to you, colleague. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thanks to you and everybody who's attending this afternoon, this important occasion. All protocol observed. I've seen all of the mentors of David are here. We greet all of them, including Peter Maibuye, who's the bigger mentor, and everybody else who's present here today. I'm gonna try and do something that I really don't like, and I fail to do it in spite of all my attempts at practicing, which is to try and read something, and I will skip, but I've already shared my notes with them, my notes with the Lelo, who will circulate and share these with others. And I mean, once again, I must thank you for this opportunity and for asking me to come and address you on this very important occasion of launching the Polisee Space, a very important thinking platform that David has been talking about, and now it is, a baby that has come into fruition. And I want to start by quoting Professor Issa Shivi, because he actually makes some very important, remarks which I think are useful for the conversation today, where he actually challenges intellectuals and asks whether or not they are producers of counter-hegemonies or they are just assembly line supervisors in a packing industry, where in a capitalist society, they are just reproducing classes as they are without getting too involved or very deep into producing counter-hegemonies, especially in unequal societies like ours. And Shivi does argue that we have two types of intellectuals in society, and the platform being launched today will let us to distinguish itself whether it becomes a collective of intellectuals in a thinking space who will be producing counter-hegemonies, or those who will be maintaining the status quo, or otherwise whether or not David will become an operator of a conveyor belt in a packaging industry, if we could use that metaphor, or whether he will be challenging dominant thinking. And from this argument that Shivi makes, therefore, we ask the question whether the Polisee space, as it is being launched, now, will it actually do what we saw some decades ago, where intellectuals who were part of the liberation movement, in fact, they joined the liberation movement, they signed or sided with the poor, and they were producing counter-hegemonies that challenged the status quo, which was colonialism as well as apartheid in our case, or whether or not this platform being launched will actually become what Mamdane calls scholars in the marketplace, where in fact nothing much happens there other than the ruinous battles of what I call a battle of relevance, or a battle of survival, or in fact a battle of association. And we see this happen in intellectuals and many think tanks in society today, because either they want to be relevant, or they want to survive, or they want to be associated, because proximity to power matters. In some instances, proximity to power brings along resources, both locally as well as international resources. Or whether we'll actually have a collective of activists, individuals who are activists, who perceive themselves as completely outside of the immediate needs of the social and political construction, such that they remain outside of the interaction in the hope that the revolution will actually unfold without their efforts or agents. And we'll recall Fanon making an argument that we've seen intellectuals who, at the eve of independence, will rally towards the party, because by rallying towards the party, they will actually endear themselves with those who are in leadership. In the process, they will be advancing. Themselves. And so the question then arises whether, in creating the platform that David is doing, whether we are going to see a vanguard of a new cadre of thinkers who will be producing ideas that challenges the status quo, but also not just to challenge, but also to come up with new ideas that will take society forward. Now, in these kinds of conversation, what often will happen amongst the intellectuals and scholars is that you see what I call an Olympic torch of self-defense being lit, because people begin to then, posture, they defend themselves, they talk about the need for them to survive because they've got manuscripts to mark and what have you, as if in fact, challenging the status quo and coming up with new ideas is actually antithetical to the idea of someone wanting to survive. What we have also seen happen, and we think that this platform David is launching will help us avoid, is the challenge where discourse, public discourse or policy discourse is credentialized in the country. In fact, even worldwide, the same way as people credentialize conversation in the political space, where people will be asking questions about where were you during this and that. And in the space like this one, people will credentialize discourse by talking about how many publications you have, what qualifications you have, and where did you get those type of qualifications. And in fact, those do matter, but it shouldn't then be the end of it all in terms of the conversation around ideas that take society forward. Because we're not in deployment politics. And therefore, David and this collective need to try to the extent possible to avoid these trappings of deployment politics, where everything else becomes about credentials, because if your credentials do not meet a particular requirement, you think that you may lose out something. We have to think way above that by producing new ideas and challenging power, as it were. And the issues we're raising, for example, around institutions is a very critical one, because even in social economics, they not necessarily look at institutions with the manner in which you were arguing earlier on, David. So I will argue that we are already, in fact, introducing a new frame of analysis by looking at the role of institutions and the power that various actors have in society, which may constrain our ability to achieve certain goals of transformation. And we then see, intellectuals in that kind of a debate, degenerating into a dilapidating state of helplessness, because they think they will not be able to make any kind of interventions. Now, as we've said, we're existing in this period of endemics and pandemics, like whether it's poverty, it's inequality, and pandemics like HIV and AIDS, and now, COVID-19. At certain instances, you do realize that there were possibilities of solutions that may be more inclusive. But depending on who is speaking, the size of the decibel and their proximity to power, certain views prevail, which may not resonate with what is happening on the ground. And therefore, the level of abstraction, it remains relevant for us to ask whether our think tanks, like the one we are launching today, are going to be producing enduring ideas in ways that will secure and rescue society from the jaws of racial capitalism and sexism. And this is a difficult one, because in this battle of survival, you may in fact end up not questioning those kind of difficult questions, because if you do ask those difficult questions, you may be thinking that you will not be getting support from those who control resources. I saw people here like Comrade Chilis and others who provide a lot of generous support on initiatives like these ones, which is very crucial, because we need to see, the black middle class coming into a party and supporting initiatives like these ones. And so we ask again, we have these endemics of economic exclusion and spatial injustice that in fact perplex leadership at times. And our responses to these endemics and pandemics, is often constrained by our ability to do what we call deep dives. And so as you launch this platform, will you then be assisting in launching deep dives so that we understand we understand how these things manifest, the social ills that people talk about, but also we need to understand the genealogy, because at times we're trying to deal with what we see in front of us, when in fact its origins are embedded in some of the decisions and actions that were taken many years ago. Now, we are a political economist, you know the concept of path dependency, but at times in public policy space, we don't look at that. As a consequence, things happen in society which become black swans, when in fact those things ought to have been understood and predicted. And so your role, what you must shoulder as a responsibility, is to help us illuminate this, identify these black swans, and eliminate the path towards dealing with this. Because if we don't do that, if we don't get into the front line of the battle of ideas as a generation, as we are attempting to do, coloniality will thrive. And we will just be struggling to understand why certain things persist in society, but it's because we failed ourselves to stretch our imaginations. But also another challenge is, how do you avoid, David and the young collective, how to avoid becoming or joining the ranks of the charlatans who parade as thinkers and intellectuals, when in fact all they are looking for, they are searching for likes and retweets, and in fact, even worse, those who are doing nothing but producing right-wing opinions when we know that they will not take society forward. Now, in the police space, David, there's something very promising that you will actually break new grounds, more so because we are going to be riding on a vast network that you have, leveraging on well-established things like Mistra, where you formally actually were initiated into systems of organizing thought. Yes, you joined the Mistra, we already establishing yourself, but what distinguishes your space currently is the fact that you now will know exactly what it means to organize thoughts and ideas in a manner that is impactful. And the presentation you made earlier on tells us that in fact we are well positioned. We are well positioned to do that, because if you don't do that, we will actually just be recycling ideas, and in the end it will become inconsequential. You are fully aware, David, that when we talk about producing counter hegemonies, we must be thinking of people like Moses Kotane, because if you read his Craddock letter, you actually can see that the idea of producing these counter hegemonies is not a new idea, because through that Craddock letter, he actually challenged the party to break away from whatever the dogma and the instructions were coming from the Soviet Union, because he was understanding that the conditions on the ground in South Africa at the time were different, and therefore he argues that you needed to Africanize the party. That is just but one example that shows that there's a long tradition, in fact, of doing so in South Africa. You now know that by doing this, you might be reviving the New African movement as argued by Ntongela Masilela, and you may be joining the ranks. In fact, history will tell whether you might as well be the new generation of the AC Jordan, of Z.K. Matthews, of Bessie Head, of Phyllis Dandala, Achima Fege, the Vilakazi, as well as the Jomo brothers. And the jury is out, because it is possible that you might actually be doing so. You will recall finally that in West and East Africa, just after independence, you had a generation of scholars who were fully engaged, who married themselves, their lives, their pursuits with the struggles of the masses. And at times, if you then have a disconnection between those who are thinking and the people on the ground, you have a kind of public policy that is not necessarily responsive. And through what we're presenting earlier on, hopefully, you are now going to be narrowing that gap between those who are making policy and those to whom policy is implemented. And in doing so, therefore, avoid this dilapidating battle of relevance, survival, and association, which seems to preoccupy a lot of our intellectuals in society today. And you do know that when people erect statues and celebrate those who've come before, it is precisely because they valued what they represented. And if they don't do so, they will desecrate even their graves at times, because they actually have no respect for the contribution that they will have made. So the nexus between policy and thinking and action need to be closed by young people like yourself, with all the energy and the networks that you have, in order to open the doors of learning across. And those who must learn at times is ourselves, who sit in positions of power, because if we don't learn to unlearn what we have learned, we will now be replicating and reproducing things that are not necessarily working. And contemporary endemics and pandemics demands differently of us. Now, you say in your logo that your motto is to imagine, create, and evolve. Hopefully, with the collective that we are putting together now, you will embrace knowledge systems from all over the world globally, such that you are an institution that is steeped in pluriversality, with the understanding that there is values that are carried by knowledges of the global north and values carried by the knowledge systems of the global south, and they must find a nexus through the platform that you have, such that we then find solutions to the problems that are actually challenging our society and keeping the majority at the back. You made a point about lobbying. That is a very critical space that needs to be closed so that we deal with what you call the black market. And there's very few people who actually have constructed that as a system of analysis of what is happening in society, because people tend to go with the cliches that are popular, which then deteriorate the argument, as it were. Thank you once again for inviting me to make a few remarks on this platform. I've forwarded this to you. Good luck to you. As you say, let us imagine, create, and evolve public policy in the best interest of the majority. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ngwane. Thank you very much for those remarks. You touch on a series of questions or series of issues that I think are very poignant and very important, which of course in many instances showcase, I suppose, the kind of work that ought to be done by such a space, in the sense of the kinds of questions that need to be addressed, part of which tickles my fancy in many instances, my intellectual fancies in many respects, is the historicity of these debates that we are reintroducing back into the South African context, which is to say that some of the considerations, yes, they might be enlivened anew with younger people who are considering the questions from different vantage points and perspectives, but these are not new questions. These are historical questions. These are questions that have been considered not only in the South African context, but on further afield on the African continent, which is also to say part of the work in many respects that ought to be constitutive of the policy spaces to break down South African exceptionalism so as to facilitate imaginative ways of thinking about public policy and our strategic intervention into public policy. I would now like to introduce two of my colleagues who we will have the wonderful opportunity of working and thinking alongside as we do this work of reconsidering, I suppose, historical questions, as Mr. Ngwane has suggested. And here I have got two colleagues, Ukwezi Mabasa as well as Zulwanda Mankwelane. Kwezi has 12 years of lecturing at university, working in the progressive trade union movement as National Social Policy Coordinator Program Manager at the Friedrich Ebert Station, and is currently working as a Senior Researcher Political Economy at the Mapungubwe Institute, which is MISTRA. I also have Ululu Mankwelane, Ulwanda Mankwelane. Fortunately enough, Lulu and I read together for our first year back in 2014, all those many, many moons ago. It feels like yesterday, but it was yesterday actually in comparison to some of the folk we have with us in the room. Lwanda's skills and experience are in qualitative research methodologies, social and expansive learning, theoretical frameworks, knowledge, and content creation. She serves on the Fourth Corps Agricultural and Training Institute, Curriculum Advisory Committee. She is a researcher on the Amanzi for Food program funded by the Water Research Council, and she's a former communications personnel on non-profit Teach One Eastern Cape Awareness Campaign. Colleagues, I'd like to start off with Ukwezi, and then I'll move on to Ulwanda. And I would like for the both of us to please speak successively. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Program Director. Evening, comrades, friends, and colleagues. I'm going to make 4 points around both the significance of the Institute itself and some thinking around its orientation and approach to public policy. The first point I want to make is the question that has been raised already by both Busani and David around rethinking approaches to public policy. I think one of the crucial things that we've learned from the experiences with the pandemic is that hyper-specialization is not helpful for solving complex problems, both in South Africa and in the world. And so in other words, we need to adopt what I think holistic analysis that cuts across disciplines and areas of speciality. And I think this is important for drawing from different disciplines that we have amongst the associates of the Institute. People often complain about the problems of compartmentalization and lack of coordination in public policy making and thinking. And I would argue, Program Director, that it stems from this obsession with hyper-specialization. Now, if one looks at the group of associates that are initiating this particular institute, you can already see that we're trying to draw on the different approaches that move us away from this notion of hyper-specialization. There are young people with different skill sets and experiences, which help us understand the complex phenomena, complex social, political, and economic phenomena that we're confronted with in the 21st century. The second point that I want to make speaks to the importance of the revival and reproduction of young public intellectuals in South Africa with a Pan-Africanist orientation. I think this is very important because when one observes the public policy discourse or the research discourse in South Africa, one worries or is concerned that there's always an insular or sometimes parochial focus on the country, without connecting it to global macro trends. But secondly, also, Chair, we know that our continent has a history of producing young intellectuals through different generations who have always contributed to the liberation of our people, but also rethinking notions of development in society and governance. And I think here I want to point us and remind us about the seminal contribution made by the eminent political economy scholar, the late Professor Thandike Mkandawire, in his seminal article on 3 generations of African scholars. And there he was posing important questions around the link between scholarship, intellectualism, and social transformation, and also the need to always reproduce different generations across time. So I think this is very important. And we know that we exist in an era where the principles of individualism and neoliberalism have permeated even the think tank space, where the focus is on producing research that is sometimes disconnected from our contemporary political and social economic challenges. So I think one of the critical motivating factors behind establishing this particular institution is to reassert this notion of public intellectualism that doesn't just focus on personal accolades, publishing in certain key journals, but rebuilds the notion of young intellectuals who contribute to solving societal problems. And I think this also then speaks to the principle of public interest that David highlighted in his presentation. And it is important then for the think tank to balance financial sustainability with this notion of breeding intellectuals and also producing content that contributes to the public interest and also social transformation. The third point that I want to make, Chair, Program Director, is that this institute, as David alluded to, is future orientated. And we will therefore have to focus on what I would call are the macro transitions, both in the domestic and the global context. And there are 3 of them. I think the first one is the generational transitions. As we know, our society in South Africa and also the continent is mostly comprised of young people. And we need to theorize about how do we develop this generational transition so that we can reposition Africa's position in the international division of labor. The second point is also then the importance of the digital transition and the effect it has not only on the political economy, but also on social reproduction generally. Then the third one is also the transition towards a low carbon economy. The last point that I want to make, Program Director, around the significance and the positioning of this particular institute is the role of research in strengthening or fortifying citizen participation in public policy making. And I think this is crucial because sometimes there's a discord between what is produced in think tanks and the ability of citizens to engage that material so that they can then go on and participate in public policy processes, not only at the national level, but also at the local level. So the question around the nexus between the policy and also disseminating that information in an accessible manner that empowers active citizenry will be crucial for the sustainability of this particular institute.
Luanda, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, colleagues. Due to load shedding, I will not be switching on my video. I will just be giving a very much macro and micro analysis of what I think the direction is in terms of contextually positioning the public policy in South Africa. So without wasting more time, the COVID pandemic has highlighted the deeply entrenched socioeconomic and political systematic divides premised on geopolitics and economies of scale, attributed to the global capture state that has exacerbated socioeconomic challenges of emerging economies such as ours. The adverse impacts of the pandemic further compounded by competing and contrary solution-driven nation-state fundamentalism has intensified the need for critical and analytical rigor in the quest for innovation, a step towards building anew, and towards cultivating systems of governance that are socially contemporary aware, sensitive and responsive, systems of governance that are timely, reflexive, and display levels of agility in a context that is rapidly changing. The active pursuit of neoliberalism has collectively made us vulnerable to the challenges prevalent in a multifaceted and interlinked global and knowledge production economy. We clearly see this in the problematic thematic themes that are imagined in the privatization of healthcare, not only limited to South Africa. The pandemic has and continues to challenge every aspect of state responses, ranging from socio-economic buffer strategies to more pertinent issues, clearly visible in the need to think innovatively and futuristically about the kind of South Africa we aim to create. This is acutely captured in our logo when we say imagine, create, evolve. Pertinent to our context is the need to interrogate our status as an emerging economy within context. This will assist in the conceptual framing, development, reform, policy implementation, particularly in regards to industry and skills development in conversation with international benchmarkers such as the SDG goals, climate change and sustainability discourses aimed at promoting multilateralism in synergized systems approaches. The macro, meso, and micro national and international impacts of the pandemic come at a time where South Africa is yet again faced with a political epoch. Researchers can surmise this moment perfectly to say when a crisis delegitimizes the power and authority existing, structural change is subsequently desired and is to be expected by many. Keller continues with this conversation to note that the disruptions to societal routines and expectations open up political space for actors inside and outside government to redefine issues, propose innovations, and organizational reforms. It is within that particular school of thought that the moment in time before us be understood as an open invitation to think and do differently. As young people, we must actively participate in the contestation of ideas underpinned by a commitment to critical and analytical rigor, and I believe most importantly, to the ethical and moral commitment to the collective good. As a result, socio-economic cohesion will remain the pinnacle of our collective objective. The quest for social economic cohesion is in tandem with building and strengthening institutional credibility, good governance, and service delivery. Therefore, we need to engage and understand the symbiotic relationships between policy, state, and implementation within context influenced by variables that are subject to change. The recognition that public policy is reiterative and dynamic in nature must translate in the knowledge production that responds to the socio-economic and political phenomena such as service delivery, protest, of which we are all fully aware are multifaceted in their representations and configurations. Therefore, the work must be premised on understanding systematic continuities and discontinuities that act as inhibitors to said objectives, and strategically use those as key indicators to inform, where necessary, structural change, reform, and/or transformation. A keen interest on focus, particularly within context of South Africa, would be rigorous engagement and debate with monitoring and evaluation models and/or tools used by the state that are intended to foreground implementation strategies. This will bring into question our regulatory and systems of governance praxis, their relevance or lack thereof, and more importantly, the use of monitoring and evaluation as a catalyst for citizen engagement. We again need to think innovatively in how to incorporate the knowledge production funded by the state, by state institutions such as NRF, into the state apparatuses, programs, policy, where skills capacity has proven to be weak, particularly in regards to ensuring that research lessons learned are locally adapted in ways that are transformative, just, and sustainable. This will really prove critical in responding to the challenges faced by local government. The building back better theoretical and conceptual framework thus becomes crucial for the kind of work we aim to build in strengthening and moving forward to help to locate the local good that is subject to change and sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith. Thank you very much, colleagues. Colleagues, at this particular point in time, I am going to open the floor, as it were, for question and answer session. And I'm going to invite the three representatives, as it were, of the policy space, that being the founder and executive director, as well as the two associates who have given their input in terms of positioning the policy space in terms of its contribution to public policy, in the sense of these are the three individuals from whom I will be requesting responses from. The founder and executive director is saying, and myself, I should include myself in that sum. I believe I will be moderating more than anything, sir. And should the time or the need present itself, possibly opine here and there. I'm going to take 3 questions at a time. And of course, I'm going to ask colleagues to keep it very brief. My time is 19:14 at the moment, and I'm going to give us 10 minutes to do this kind of work, really, of just fleshing out some of our ideas. I forgive my impetuousness if it might be perceived as such. However, I will stop colleagues if they are extending, because I am trying to take as many questions as possible. So Elizabeth Liz says, I wish policy space can play a role of leading crucial conversations for intellectuals and professionals, creating a platform where rich ideas can take our country forward, where this particular work can be done and harnessed. That is, I think, rather a think tank for South Africa, for South African transformation and cultural change, or shaping, as it were. South Africa is hungry for positive systems thinking rather than obsessive criticism of government with nothing to bring to the table. I would like for us to sort of, I think more than anything, that comment as opposed to a question. And I would like for us to sort of think around that, and to frame that as a question. I suppose the question for me would be, how does the policy space shift from that sort of state or government criticism per se, such that it allows itself and aligns itself to function as a complementary kind of tool without, of course, going into the dangerous territory of operationalizing knowledge for, as we have to have it, knowledge for knowledge's sake, right? So how do we do that work of balancing, I suppose, those competing objectives? That is, of course, incisive criticism that facilitates, I suppose, useful policy development, but that is not bogged down by that movement of critique. And Paul Clady says, political will, where do we have that? And I believe that that comment came through as the executive director was giving his remarks. So possibly, Mr. Executive Director, if you could give us a thought there to say, what is it? Political will, do we have such in our context as South Africa? And if we don't, how does policy space begin to function to leverage that political will in terms of anticipating some of these socio-political responses? And here I think specifically of Amartya Sen's theory around capabilities development. How do we as policy space ensure that we reach into that particular space of facilitating capabilities development, i.e. the development model that was so eruditely sketched out by Amartya Sen, as well as, of course, his colleague, Martha Nussbaum. And then, of course, we have a comment here again that says institutions have been exposed as weak since 1994. No one could have anticipated such a rapid deterioration of social and public institutions. And I'm going to again pose this to all our panelists maybe and our discussants to say, is there a possibility of the policy space being able to facilitate this kind of growth, as it were, and this re-strengthening, or maybe, I suppose, this reinsertion of confidence in our what is it called, in our public institutions? Mr. Executive Director, let me start with you, maybe to just give some thoughts around these questions. Please, colleague, go ahead. As the executive director gathers his thoughts, let me move on to possibly Kwesi. Kwesi, to give some of your thoughts, and we'll circle back to the executive director as he gathers his thoughts.
Yeah, well, I mean, I alluded to this in the presentation, but the main point was that the trust in public institutions also comes from, or is dependent on the weight of public intellectualism. And I think one of the things we have to do is reassert the value of public intellectualism outside of this narrow conception of just social mobility. And obviously, when you talk about public intellectualism, you automatically talk about intellectualism and research and policy work that grapples with questions around rebuilding public institutions and public goods. And I think that is the only way I see that we can have this nexus between the rebuilding of public intellectualism and then also the rebuilding of public institutions and public goods. Yeah, that would be my comment from that.
Thank you for that, Kwesi. Makolane?
Hello.
Luanda?
No.
Okay, Luanda seems to not is not able to join us at the moment. Maybe you are muted, colleague. Maybe try to unmute yourself. I'm not too certain. It seems as though she's not here. Mr. Executive Director, I'm going to come back to you then with this question, which is to say, how do we see policy space as an organization, as an institution, doing that double work, as it were? Number one, of maintaining a certain criticism or criticality, I suppose, towards the state as well as government, but more importantly, also being able to work in consort with state and government without necessarily instrumentalizing or operationalizing knowledge, because that then takes us into very dangerous terrain, as we saw under apartheid in those years, where the work of intellectualism actively functioned to perpetuate a socially problematically engineered status, or sort of, I suppose, status quo, yes. So how do we do that work, number one, of strengthening public institutions, working in consort with government, but at the same time, making sure that the criticality remains such that we are not seen to be perpetuating historically problematic tropes.
Okay, thanks, Program Director. I think that now I actually understand and follow your question. Thanks. It's quite a brilliant question, actually, because it actually goes to the heart of the work that we actually intend to do. You know, the starting point for us, and particularly for myself, I can speak confidently 110% for myself.
And be a player, but not participate and be a player in development. And the state is viewed as this institution that actually should only play a limited role. Some people would say it should just provide the public good, it should just regulate, it should just provide infrastructure, it should play the role of redistribution, and then it should end there. But if you look at the, if you look at the economic history, whether you look at it in any part of the world, North America, South America, Asia, Europe, and elsewhere, you will realize that the state has been instrumental in actually developing the economy and developing people. And those states that are now ahead of us, the United States, Japan, and others, have actually used, state power and the role of states in the economy and in society to actually get ahead. You talk of a state that would actually support defense industry. In our case here in South Africa, we've got a state that has participated in the telecommunications industry and successfully for the largest part of the time. So you talk of, for instance, when in this country we're introducing mobile technology and mobile telephones, the state was involved, for instance, in the development of Vodacom as a company. Now that Vodacom is a company that it used to be, right? So the idea that we are going to pursue vigorously and very strongly is one that says public policy and public affairs are not a dichotomy or binary question between the state and the private sector of business. In actual fact, even to the extent that the state withdraws from the economy, in the lifestyle economy or in the neoliberal sense, in the instance that the state withdraws, that itself is actually intervention in the economy. So our view is that there shouldn't be a dictatorship or a domination of one player over the other. But what should really happen is the identification of issues, particular goals, and particular ways of doing things, what we refer to as institutional arrangement, where the state, private role players, as well as the community and other interested parties can actually make an equal contribution to actually defining development. So that's how we would want to see the role of the state in the economy, in society, and everywhere else. We don't just see the state as we don't see public policy as a domain only of the state and government, politicians, and everywhere. we actually see public policy as an interaction between the various states, between the various actors, the various issues, the various institutions that actually define the broad public policy. That's how we actually understand it, and that's how we understand it.
Thank you, Mr. Executive Director. And I must admit, I was a bit unfair because the question is a very broad question that I think in the 26 years of democracy that we have had and enjoyed in South Africa, we are still unable to answer. Because in very real ways, a series of societal actors and functionaries are still reeling from the architecture that was set up historically in this country, which of course goes back as far back as the 1800s. So in me putting you on the spot in that way, I suppose I was performing an act of intellectual jousting to test how agilely you could be able to respond to such a question. There is, of course, one last question. I'm cognizant of time, colleagues, as we have run over our time. There is one question that comes from Ulutando Brukwe, who says, how will this particular institute manage the balance between sustainability, or what David calls commercial work, and societal needs, which might be ethical and moral, but does not pay the bills? As sometimes the climate change debate is noble, but does not easily translate to poverty alleviating initiatives in the broad or narrow sense, depending on your point of departure. He who pays the bills can determine the direction or influence the approach, as autonomy is relevant and paying your bills is reality. Now, if I might take that particular question, Mr. Executive Director, I would like to address this particular one. There are two things that I think are very, very important here, which is to say, in many instances, what I foresee the policy space doing is that I foresee it first and foremost reimagining the functionary of knowledge production in South Africa, and of course within the regional community. This is to say that how we have historically perceived knowledge and knowledge production is through its commodification, its monetization. Now, while that is useful, the reality of the matter is that when you're living in a developmental state, there needs to be, in many instances, developmental goals that ought to be taken into consideration, which is to say necessarily pertinent socio-political questions. This, of course, is a much more bigger question, I think, which cannot be necessarily taken up by the policy space itself as a research institute, but requires collective buy-in, what I have termed in my own scholarship previously, the notion of a shifting, which is to say, this is how we then begin to leverage even the university sector to shift its understanding in terms of monetization of research, monetization of thought, as well as its commercialization, subsequently being able to respond to what we can understand as the local context, right? So shifting from what I call a vertical accountability, moving into a horizontal accountability, right? And this is important for us in terms of being able to produce knowledge, number one, that speaks to our context, and number two, that is responsive to our context, but at the same time is able necessarily to garner these kinds of economic rewards that facilitate our ability to pay our bills, as it were. And of course, this is an ongoing conversation and an ongoing debate, which requires, as I say, maybe our particular use as the policy space to be able to leverage quite significantly the ways in which certain sectors of society function and how they view their role. Because in many respects, if we go back to the historical organizing legislation, it demands of a developmental state such as ours that knowledge ought to serve the needs of the majority, the needs of the disenfranchised, the needs of the people. Now, I have a hand here from Kumani. Kumani, I'll literally give you 30 seconds, colleague, to pose your contribution or question. Otherwise, I will have to continue because we are incredibly out of time. Kumani?
Sorry, thank you very much. It seems to me, based on the presentation that has been made in terms of the imagination of this institute, that it presents a public posture. But we know historically that these kind of institutes are very elite in their nature. Of course, their presentation is always from the top up, the intellectual production of the concepts that have been planted. Therefore, I'm interested, how will it be differ from the existing institutes that seeks to perpetuate or set or give credence to the political or the economic elite as opposed to the general public? Wait.
The point is taken.
No, wait. I just want to conclude with this question. Wait, because you don't know the essence of my question. I'm interested because the South African geography, in terms of the human capital, the people, they are not necessarily total consumers of the knowledge that seems to be presented by the Institute today. But I'm interested, therefore, how are you going to be able to disseminate these particular services which are knowledge-based in a society that seems to be anti-education?
Thank you, colleague. Thank you very much for that. The first thing that I would just say as an intervention there is to say, let us not underestimate the thirst that the broader South African public has for ideas. This is to say that in many respects, knowledge and the way in which it has been packaged historically has been packaged in very particular kinds of ways, which have given us a certain demography that then suggests that that is the community that is receptive to knowledge. What I am suggesting in maybe very crude terms is to say, let us not dumb down the South African citizenry and the polity, because I am certain they are very, very keen for the kinds of debates and ideas that we are sort of generating here. And of course, we heard from the advisory words of Mr. Ngqweni, who suggests to us that in many instances, this particular policy space ought to shift in the ways in which it interacts with knowledge production, in the ways in which it disseminates knowledge production. And we have a set, and when I say a set, I'm not talking about one or two, I'm talking about a set of experienced colleagues who are joining this space as seasoned associates, who are able to discern, number one, socio-political questions of poignant concern, and are able to then conduct research that responds to those questions in very many useful ways. There are ways in which we are sort of testing out this idea of knowledge dissemination, not only in the English or colonial languages as we know them, but also dissemination of knowledge in our own local languages. The folk who join the policy space today as the inaugural associates are very skilled, and I would suggest very erudite in their various areas of specialization, who will be able to address very pertinent socio-political questions within society. I trust that answers the question, Khumani, which is also to say we will be testing new ways of doing things. Again, this is a space that is birthing anew and reconsidering anew old questions. With that said, colleagues, thank you very much for indulging us in terms of the question and answer session. I now wish to move on to Dr. Chirizi Ratsitanga, who will be giving us, in many respects, a welcome to the think tank industry space. And he is, of course, an author as well as a board member of MISTRA, and has an illustrious set of credentials that he again brings to the space, which I suppose goes back to answer Khumani's concern around how we will be approaching this work in terms of doing things differently. And I would suggest that the skill set that this space has is quite useful in terms of being able to do that work. Dr. Chirizi, maybe you might in fact do a better job of answering that question than I have, but over to you in terms of your remarks, welcoming us to the think tank industry. Thank you very much.
Good evening, colleagues, and thank you, Program Director. And I would like to say upfront, congratulations, David Maimela, and all the associates that you have been able to put together to create a policy space, because I'm quite proud, because I believe that it represents a major milestone for intellectuals in our generation. It matters that is being created by yourself and who falls within this generation, because I'm sure that many know out there that I don't hesitate nowadays to agitate for generational convergence, because I believe that the time for this generation to rise and occupy its rightful space of responsibilities and duties for the nation is now. At the outset, let me also say on behalf of you, David, my brother, And I do this because I know that you wouldn't mind. Let me say on your behalf that I would like to acknowledge and give thanks to people and institutions that have been behind your success. And here, a few of these will include your own family, including your wife and children and your parents and immediate relatives, but also the African National Congress, the South African Student Congress, the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, as well as the government spaces where you have worked, because I believe that you amassed the necessary experience and skills to put together this very important institution on the basis of that background of a life that has so far been lived in that manner. Indeed, therefore, let me do my duty of welcoming the policy space to the think tank industry. You did make reference to this, that there are quite a lot of think tanks around the world. I think they are counted at 8,400 thereabout, majority of which are in the United States of America. And it has been said that only 7.4% of those are in Africa, which means that there is a room for a lot more think tanks in our continent. The important question is how therefore do you differentiate yourself if you bring yourself into a space which already has such large presence? And more importantly, I think by way of encouraging you to invoke the biblical story, when confronted with a Goliath, David, which is going to be the stone that you will use to survive. For today, you have attained victory by launching this critical think tank institute. But as I've said elsewhere, once you win the battle, you should know that the war has just begun. Is the policy space entering the research industry simply to add into it or to catalyze a paradigm shift? I think Principal Busani was asking similar such questions. Paradigm being understood to be dominant set of ideas or theory of the state of affairs. A paradigm shift refers to a fundamental change with regard to the underlying assumptions of an existing paradigm. We know now that all the boundaries of the social world are constructed. In other words, the current state of affairs that presents itself as the dominant truth is the result of a social construct. Schumpeter teaches us that the truth has ideological underpinnings. Therefore, ideological consciousness will be crucial for any attempt at altering the current state of affairs. In other words, the current dominant construct of society. To achieve this change, Schumpeter asserts that we have to step outside of our current boundaries and go beyond what is factually known. To do this, you need to be normative in your approach and attitude to inquiry, because to step outside of the norm is itself based on normative grounds. Therefore, all new knowledge is best created on the basis of asking questions that shake the current view of facts and their context. In a nutshell, a reputable think tank cannot be sustained on the basis of adopting ideological neutrality. And I'm happy to have heard you, Executive Director David Maimela, to state exactly this fact. The ideological posture of policy space will determine its impact in the think tank industry. And I hope, in keeping with the pregnant motto of the policy space, which is imagine, create, innovate, policy space will emphasize an African epistemological vantage point and foundation in terms of its contribution to the thinking space. A lot has been said about interdisciplinarity, yet you rarely find a research institute that truly integrates indigenous knowledge systems, for example, into their research methods and general accumulation of knowledge they produce and share with the world. Our country and continent is blessed with myriad of non-certificated organic intellectuals who have something to say about these issues that your institute is dealing with, but issues that we like to think are too abstract for them to contribute in the discourse of. Executive Director David Maimela, what you have entered is the space of intellectual entrepreneurship. And intellectual entrepreneurship requires that you go beyond your intellectual prowess, which is unquestionable. Therefore, give enough attention to what it means to be an intellectual entrepreneur. We can talk about this, I'm sure, in many times to come. Welcome Polisee Space to the think tank industry. We hope that, as Wallin postulated, the paradigm shift that will emerge from your entering the space will not just be in the form of theoretical offerings that move us away from the current dogmas that define the limitation of our societal construct, but will be felt as a result of actual change that will emerge because of the disruptions that will accompany the entry of Polisee Space and its offerings in the thinking vocation. In other words, the mastering of what I like to call theoretical praxis. Using the analogy of the tree, which is the dominant image on the logo of Polisee Space, let me say in conclusion that be able to weather the storms. When there's a storm and they look at you, let them swear that this tree may fall. Yet when they watch this tree's trunk, let them see its stability. Congratulations once more, David Maimela and all the associates of the new baby on the block, the current ones and future ones. Best wishes, my dear friend, comrade, and colleague. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Trizi, and colleagues, just as a way of sort of locating that contribution, it comes from the author of New Cities, New Economies, who's also the chair and founder of the New Cities, New Economies Corporation, an entity that is facilitating the creation of new cities that anchor new economic nodes in South Africa and the rest of the African continent. So thank you very much, Dr. Trizi, for those, I suppose, very, very comforting words, in the sense of, indeed, it will not be child's play, this kind of work that has been begun here today, but it will require innovative and critical thought, and of course, work that will be the case with any good idea. I now wish to hand over to my colleague and fellow associate, Prudent, who will give us the vote of thanks this evening and unburden me of this great responsibility I have carried tonight. Prudent, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumalo. I must say it's indeed a pleasure to be part of the Polisee Space. I mean, a lot has been spoken and great thoughts have been shared. Without any further ado, my job is just to say a brief word, and mainly would like to acknowledge everyone who was present. We wish to thank the key people who were important to the establishment and the launch of the Polisee Space. Firstly, thank you, Mr. Program Director. And we'd like to thank all the our honorable guests, Mr. Busani Ngaweni, for a very productive and insightful discussion. Thank you, sir. We'd like to thank Ukwezi and Rwanda for all the reflections and the various opportunities and the prospects of that the Polisee Space will offer. Also like to thank board Dr. Chilizira Chitanga. Thank you for gracing us and welcoming us in the think tank space and the wider market of ideas. Other thanks go to various other people who were really critical in the Polisee Space. Me Nombulelo Ngatela, the executive director, will agree with me. He thanks you for the unwavering support and guidance and all the criticism. It's highly appreciated. We'd like to thank the technical team, Sipo Makalima, Tepo Tweni, of Disable Technologies for the development of the websites, the technical support that they provided for this launch. And then we'd like to thank Bonso Molefe for the beautiful logo and the marketing, also the branding material. The piece of work is really amazing. Thanks. I would also like to thank Karabo Masuku of Scotty Business Advisory for the compliance matters. Thank also Mujalefa Mutalani and Presi Machaba of Mutalani Incorporated for all the legal services. I appreciate it as well. To Dr. Bandile Masuku, thank you for the encouragement and support. Also like to thank all our special inaugural associates, myself included. The executive director says that we are really brave and we are risk takers, that we are. So he thanks us for the spirit and then taking a leap of faith as being associates to something new and something that I believe will be great and amazing. Yeah, it's been a great day. We would like to also thank all the members of the media for gracing us with their presence. Last, but most importantly, we'd like to acknowledge our honored guests for their presence, all the suggestions, the question and answers. Some of them I'm still jotting down in my head and trying to figure out what the answer is, but thank you to the program director and the executive director for answering most of the questions that I wouldn't know where to start. So we thank you for the participation, all the services that you'll be bringing to us so that we can be of assistance. And hopefully we will start the booking as soon as possible. Thank you everyone for choosing us tonight.
Thank you very much, Prudence, for that very comprehensive kind of vote of thanks. And I'm not going to be repetitive, but I think I ought to stress really the deep sense of gratitude that is felt by the Polisee Space Collective for the various parties who came to the party this evening to join us and to support this kind of work that we are doing. And the hope, of course, is that we will indeed not disappoint, but aim to create really agile and novel responses to pressing socio-political questions as we consider them both as a country, but also as a regional community on the subcontinent of Africa. Colleagues, thank you very much for that. I believe with those words, it is, I bid you adieu, good night, and thank you for joining us. We will play out, of course, I believe, with the website, as well as some of the stuff that sort of gave us a bit of some technical glitches at the beginning. Stay along to see that. Check out the website, follow us on our various handles, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And of course, there will be content coming out quite systematically from the work that has been done by associates, because they hold that title, of course, necessarily because of the work that they've done. So that will be coming out. Watch out for that on the website, as well as our various social media platform and fora. Thank you, colleagues, and a lovely evening to you all.
The Polisee Space is a progressive Pan-African public policy consulting firm. It delivers its services through a network of associates who are enthusiastic about public policy innovation. True to its innovative method of delivery, the Polisee Space will maximize on the use of digital platforms like its official website to interact and inform the public on some of its cutting-edge work. The Polisee Space website has 5 important features. The first is an extensive biography of all its associates, which can be found under the Associates tab in the website. This is so that you are aware that your work is in capable hands of South Africa's most forward and thought leaders. The second is a list of services that the Polisee Space will offer. You can find this listed under Services. At the bottom of the page, you will find a shortcut button to a form you can fill in should you wish to procure any of the services on offer. The organization will make direct contact with you upon filling in the form. The third important feature is the ability to fund a special project. The special projects are listed both under the landing page and under the tab Special Projects. These special projects are self-initiated by the organization and will require your generous donations to be completed. The shortcut button available both on the landing page and the tab Special Projects will direct you to a short form to fill in should you wish to make a donation. The fourth important feature is both the Multimedia Resource Tab and the Media tab, which will feature important documents, podcasts, videos, articles, and other important work by the organization. Finally, the organization would love to interact with you. The phone number, email address, and social media pages can be found under the Contact Us tab or right at the bottom of the landing page. We look forward to interacting with you.